Jesus once said, "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure buried in a field that a man found and reburied. Then in his joy he goes and sells everything he has and buys that field." Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. When he found one priceless pearl, he went and sold everything he had and bought it. Two parables with exactly the same punchline. In the first parable, there's a guy, he's working in the field, and as he's working through the field, digging and plowing or whatever it is he's doing, he comes across buried treasure. And he's like, "Oh my goodness, wow, this is an incredible find." So he reburies the treasure, goes out, puts an offer in on the field, but to buy the field, he has to sell everything that he has. And he does it with joy, sells it all, buys the field, because he knows that what's in the field is worth more than everything else that he had. And so he buys the field. In the second parable, there's a merchant who trades in fine pearls. And this guy, he knows what a pearl of great value is really like. What makes a pearl a great one, a priceless one. And in his travels, he comes across one. And so he, again, wants that pearl desperately. And so he sells everything that he has and he buys the pearl with joy, because he knows that the pearl that he now owns is worth more than everything else that he had. It's worth more than everything else that he had to give up. It's worth it all. The point that Jesus is making to me and to you is that being a kingdom citizen is indeed very costly. You and I will have to get rid of everything else in comparison to our love for God. And it will be very costly to be a Jesus follower. But it is worth every bit. That's why in the Sermon on the Mount, the part that we looked at in part 1, Jesus said, "Blessed are those who enjoy the King's reign and the blessings he brings. Favored are the ones who have become kingdom citizens. They are the lucky ones, no matter what it costs. They're the ones who are blessed. They're the ones who are favored by God. They are the ones who are in the most enviable position, because they are part of the kingdom." Jesus cast that incredible vision for us and helped us to see what really is valuable and the incredible worth of the invitation that he's offered to us to be not just a listener, but a learner, a person who's part of the kingdom. Here in part 2 of this series, we're going to look at more of Jesus' incredible vision for the lives of his disciples. So let's just jump into it, okay? Matthew 5:13, Jesus continues, "You are the salt of the earth." Now, when he says you, he is clearly pointing to his followers, his disciples. Sometimes I use the word apprentices, the ones who are the learners, not just the listeners. That's who the you are. And he says, "You are the salt of the earth." This statement, you are the salt of the earth. You are. That's an identity, a link to a purpose or a function. Or we could use the word a role, right? You are the salt of the earth. And because there is an important role, it comes with some obviously important responsibilities. You think about how this plays out, like being a mom. That's a role. That's an identity that implies a function and therefore certain responsibilities, right? With your mom, right? That's your identity. That's your role. But you have some functions that you do. There's things you do. There are also some things that you don't do because of who you are. If you are a best friend to someone, we could say that's your identity or that's your role. But that role, that identity implies that you have a function, right? You're not just a best friend. You're going to act like a best friend. You're going to function as a true friend. And therefore you have certain responsibilities. And there's some things that you don't do. And there's some things that you do because you are a best friend, right? You show up when they need you. You care. You don't want to run away. You listen to the same stupid joke 3 times, whatever it is, right? Because you are a best friend. You're going to see that same pattern here in what Jesus says in this section about when you are something, then you do certain things and you don't do other things because your role has certain responsibilities that go along with that. So you are the salt of the earth. Now, salt is a word that's used many times in the Bible. It's a metaphor for several different things in the scriptures. And the context is the key to figuring out what it stands for in that particular case. In this case, notice that Jesus' disciples are the salt of the earth. They're not the salt of the kingdom. They're the salt of the earth. Therefore, the function that goes with this role of being the salt of the earth is something that they do for the earth, for the world. It's not something they do primarily for the kingdom. It's what they do for the people of the world. So what is it that they do? Because salt does many things, right? It adds flavor, right? But the big one that I think would have been in the minds of Jesus' hearers is this. It acts as a preservative. You rub a little bit into the meat, and it keeps the meat from rotting. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, you are the salt of the earth. You preserve the world from decay. Right? You preserve the world from decay. The world would rot if it wasn't for you. And so you are the salt of the earth. You have a function. You have a responsibility, and the world desperately needs it. Nobody loves decayed meat. It smells bad. I am a recreational cyclist, and sometimes when I'm riding my bike along the edge of the road, I will smell roadkill. And in those moments, it's like, oh, pedal faster, right? Yeah, stinky poo, right? Our world is corrupt. It's decaying, it's rotting, and Jesus' disciples help preserve that world. This is one of the reasons why God doesn't take kingdom citizens straight to heaven after their conversion, because they've got a role, a function, a responsibility here. Now, Jesus doesn't mention exactly how we do this salt thing, how we prevent the decay, but there's reason to believe that the good deeds, the good works that he mentions just a few verses later in verse 16, have a dual effect that applies to both of these role metaphors that Jesus gives us in this portion of his incredible speech. Jesus' disciples, by doing good works, those good works keep the world from being as bad as it could be, like salt. They prevent some decay. But second, they show the world the truth and a better way, like light. And we'll get to that part, that metaphor, in just a moment. So Jesus continued, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt should lose its taste, or its saltiness, some versions say, if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. So, because you are the salt of the earth, I said that with a role, there's some things we do and there's some things that we don't do. So what don't we do? Well, Jesus says you don't let your saltiness get lost. Right? If you're the salt of the earth, you got to keep that saltiness, that salt flavor, that salt taste, that salt ability. And I'm sure that's not a word, but just made it up, right? You don't let that saltiness get lost, which leads to a question. How does a person lose their saltiness? How does salt lose their saltiness? We'll look at that first. This stuff. So, sodium chloride is a stable compound, and technically it can't lose its saltiness. It's not like a radioactive element that has a half-life, and if you let it sit too long, it decays into something else. It's not like that. Salt is very stable, and it can't lose its saltiness. And so this might be a little bit of a mind bender for us. I'm sure it wasn't for Jesus' audience, because as archaeologist Eugene Dietrich points out, much of the salt used in Jesus' day was not Himalayan pink salt. Right? No. And it didn't come from the sea either. It wasn't sea salt. It didn't come from evaporating salt water. No, it came from salty marshes, and as a result, it had a fair amount of impurities in it. And the salt part that was in we'll call it the salt mix, the salt part of the salt mix with the impurities was much more soluble than the impurity part. And so during times of high humidity, the humid conditions would dissolve the salt and cause it to run out, right, leak out, leaving only the unsalty impurities behind. And so you had a thing of salt, you had a salt shaker, but the salt part was gone. It had run out, right, into the bottom of the pottery, and you just had more of the impurity mix left. And so the salt had lost its saltiness. And that unsalty residue wasn't good for flavoring or preserving. It it didn't taste great. It tasted like dirt. And it didn't preserve meat. It just made it dirty. It didn't stop the decay. It just made it dirty, decaying meat. So its only real use was, they found that if you put it up on like things like that you wanted to make hard, mud, things you want to make harder, it seemed to harden it. So one of the things that they would do with it is they'd put it up on their flat roofs, because they used their roofs of their homes, their flat roofs, a lot like patios. And kids would go up there and play. You'd go up there and have a meal in the evening or whatever and let the breeze come by. And so this salt that was no longer salty, you could throw it up on top of there and you could step on it and kind of grind it in, and it would help harden and help leak-proof the roof. Or maybe if you had like a little path right in front of the house, maybe you'd put it there. And so it made sense when Jesus said to them, listen, if the salt loses its saltiness, the only thing it's good for is to be thrown out and stepped on, right? But that felt like such a waste for something that was so expensive in the first place. So that's how the salt lost its saltiness. How does a person lose their saltiness? Well, kind of like salt that comes from salt marshes. When Jesus saves us, we have impurities, don't we? We are a mix of the new heart and the divine nature and the Holy Spirit, right? And new desires and new power, all that stuff that we talk about. We're a mix of that along with very old habits. Right? As one person famously said, we pick up things from our family of origin, and so God lives in our heart and Grandpa lives in our genes, right? Not our blue genes, like our DNA type genes. We have habits that we've picked up. We have responses that we've habitually do and things like that. We have values that are still messed up. We have thinking patterns that are not helpful. They're not godly. So how do we, as a person, lose our saltiness? Well, we lose our saltiness when we allow the impurity to stay and the holiness of Jesus to be lost. We lose our saltiness when we become like the world rather than like Jesus in our values and our beliefs and behaviors and speech. Now, by the way, when I was a kid, maybe it still works this way, I don't know, but sometimes people would read passages like this and they'd say, okay, so we got to be different from the world, and it's not different for different sake. It's different as in, I want to be like Jesus, and I realize that the world probably isn't going to be like Jesus. Those who just want to be different for different sake, that's not salt, that's just weird. I better get back to what Jesus said. Jesus continues, you are the light of the world. You, Jesus followers, you have an identity, a role that's linked to a purpose and a function, and therefore some responsibilities. You are the light of the world. You illuminate Jesus' disciples. You illuminate or make the truth and the kingdom visible. How are people going to know what the truth is? They're going to see you live it out. How are they going to know what the kingdom is all about and what Jesus is all about and the difference that Jesus makes? They're going to see you live it out. You're going to illuminate what truth is, what the kingdom is like, right? What God is like. You're going to illuminate. You're going to let them see that. Just like light shines and we're able to see. That's what you're going to be. And the world desperately needs that. They need disciples who are going to illuminate. They need disciples who are going to show them what the truth is and what God is like. This is why Ron Hutchcraft famously said, most people become a believer and a follower of Jesus before they become a believer in Jesus. They see it first in you. Paul said something similar to what Jesus said in this passage. Paul said it to the Philippians. This is Philippians chapter 2, and you'll notice it has both ideas, the idea of salt that hasn't lost its purity and the idea of light in the world. This is Philippians 2, verse 12. Therefore, my dear friends, just as you've always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but even more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it's God who is working in you both to will and to work according to his good purposes. And then Paul gives them a couple specifics. He says, do everything without grumbling or arguing. Why? Because that's like Jesus and unlike the world, right? He says, so do everything without grumbling and arguing so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation, right? In a decaying world, you're salt. Then he continues, among whom you shine like stars in the world by holding firm to the word of life. You're salt, you're light, Paul said. He got that from Jesus. Back to Jesus, Matthew 5, verse 14. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. I find that remarkably encouraging. If our role is to be light, and it is, it's impossible to fail because we are a city on the hill, and you can't hide that. Jesus continues, a city situated on a hill can't be hidden. No one lights a lamp, puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men. So if my role is to be light the light of the world, what don't I do? Well, I don't hide. Right? In light of my function and the world's desperate need, it would be nonsense to hide the light, to somehow try to make it so they can't see it. Right? Jesus continues, in the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. So what don't you do? You don't hide. What do? You do good works that are visible. So you are light. You don't hide. You do good works that are visible. Any particular works, right? Any good works in particular? Well, yeah, Jesus would go on to say on several occasions, one thing that would set his people apart, they would make it so people are like, that's a Jesus follower, I can just tell, is this, love one another. He said, by this, everyone's going to know. Everyone will know you're my disciples if you love one another. And then the second thing that in my reading and going back through the scriptures has really started to stand out to me that had a profound impact in Jesus' day and is a practical implication of this love one another idea, and is this: practice hospitality. This is an incredibly good work that is visible. When you practice hospitality, when you invite somebody into your life and into your world, and so you do a meal, you do dessert, you do coffee with them. In Jesus' day, it was a huge thing because whoever you spent time with over food, it was shouting to them and to anyone else watching, I accept this person at least in some way. I accept them. And you know the influence that acceptance brings, right? When somebody welcomes us into their life and they accept us, they have influence over us because we just give it to them. We are creatures that are drawn to acceptance. And Jesus taught this hospitality thing. He would go and he would spend time with people, and you'll see it all through the New Testament, this command to hospitality. And let me just quick time out. When I talk hospitality, as somebody just pointed out to me, Andy, make sure you're clear to say your hospitality, not hosting. Hosting is when I get the house spotless. And I make the one dish that I make better than any other, and I have, right, in my premier dessert or whatever. I've got all the flavors for my coffee or what. That's hosting. That's not necessarily hospitality. Hospitality is, well, I eat with you, and I let you see maybe me or life as it really is. So maybe the house isn't spotless, and the kids aren't incredibly well behaved, or the food isn't the absolute most gourmet thing I can cook. We're doing a meal together. The point is for me to be with you and you to be with me. The point isn't for me to impress you. So practice hospitality, not hosting. I'm not talking about hosting, hospitality. That is a good work. It's like a light that's on a hill. You can't ignore that. When people see that, when they experience that, that is a good work that cannot be missed. It's one that's visible. And if we do it as hospitality rather than hosting, it's one that gives glory to our Father rather than credit to us. All right, let's pull this together, wrap it up. We only looked at a few verses today. But we see that Jesus has a vision for a world that is a far better place. He has this vision for the world. It's the kingdom, right? Where God is in charge, and because God is in charge, things work. And they work the way they're supposed to work. And people are valued. And they're valued the way and the amount that they're supposed to be valued. And they're not abused, and they're not trying to take advantage of each other, and they're not trying to leverage things, and they're not trying to compete and promote and try to prop up their self-esteem, right? Jesus has a vision for the world, and it's a world that is a far, far better place. He has a vision for the kingdom of heaven. But Jesus also has a vision for a world where every Jesus disciple has an important and impactful role. I'm going to go off for a second. This is somewhere between soapbox, rant, aside, and rabbit trail. One of the things that breaks my heart is as I look at people, so many today are under unbelievable pressure. They've got to choose everything, and they've got to find everything and figure out everything. And so one of the things that they have to find, and they're under tremendous pressure to find, is a career and a job that's going to fulfill them, right? So they got to find a career that fits them perfectly, because they hear those sayings like, if you love your work, you'll never work another day of your life. And so you got to find the thing that you love, got to find your passion, and then your dream job. So you got to not just figure out what it is, you got to find a place that will support that, a place that has a great work environment, so there's no toxicity, low drama. It will pay you well to do what you would do for free. That is hard to find. And it's a tremendous bill for a job. Like jobs are pretty good at giving us enough money to eat food, put clothes on our back, and live indoors. But to fulfill us, provide meaning for our lives, and give us a way to change the world, that's a lot to ask for from a job. But that is not too much to ask for from the roles that Jesus picked out for you and for me. That's not too much to ask for being salt and light. Those things, those roles, are incredibly important. Every one of us wants to know that what we do matters, at least to somebody, and that it makes a difference, right? And you can't be salt and light and it not matter. Because salt prevents decay. It keeps the world from being worse than it is. And light shows and illuminates and lets people see and makes the world a better place. You can't be what Jesus has envisioned for you and not have an important role and an impactful role, which then leads to the question I want to leave us with today in this part. Am I embracing Jesus' vision? Like in both parts of it. Jesus' vision for a world that's a far better place. Jesus' vision for the kingdom of heaven. Am I embracing that? Like, wow, that's like the pearl that was worth it. That's like the buried treasure. Wow, I would love to be part of that, and I'd love to be part of making that happen. I want to be part of the kingdom. Am I embracing Jesus' vision? That part. Am I also embracing Jesus' vision where every Jesus disciple, every Jesus follower has an important and impactful role? Salt of the earth, light of the world. Am I embracing his vision? Am I embracing my role? Let's take a few days to ponder that, and we'll come back in part 3, hear more of what Jesus has to share with us in this incredible sermon we call the Sermon on the Mount.